It's always a privilege and a pleasure to be here at Malaprops, virtually or otherwise. And I want to thank all of our audience, all of our virtual audience for joining us this evening. We have a very wonderful book this evening and distinguished guests, the author and her interviewer and colleague. And I'll introduce them in just a moment, which is a true pleasure. I just want to say a little bit about the University of North Carolina Press before I introduce the evening. The press, for which I'm a representative on the Advancement Council, which is a statewide council here in Western North Carolina. I am just so thrilled to be part of it. I didn't know very much about the UNC Press before I joined this council, and I just want to share with you that the press turned 100 years old last year. So we are embarking on our second century. The University of North Carolina Press amazingly publishes 125 books a year, which is a book about every 3 days. These books are very carefully peer-reviewed. They are deeply trustworthy in terms of research and information. They are also wonderful books. They tend to win awards. Over half of them win awards, in fact, including National Book Awards, Pulitzer Prizes in History, and the Bancroft Prize. So these are truly remarkable books, as you'll hear this evening. Many of our books are by leading scholars for use in the academy. Many serve general readers, many do both, and they cover a very wide range of topics. Overall, they represent real courage and real excellence in publishing, and I'm very proud to present this evening. So to introduce our speakers, first of all, I'd like to welcome the author of this book, who launched it last night, I understand. And we're very lucky to have her here from Indiana, zooming in. And this is the book. You will see, you saw it a minute ago. It is like all UNC Press's books, it's a beautifully produced book. And our author tonight is Amrita Chakrabarti Myers. She is the Ruth and Hall's Associate Professor of History and Gender Studies at IU in Bloomington. She is also the author of Forging Freedom, Black Women and the Pursuit of Liberty in Antebellum, Charleston, which I now want to read also. And having read this book, she is a marvelous writer as well as a marvelous historian. I also would like to introduce her interlocutor this evening. We're honored to have often a partner in a discussion, which makes these especially good presentations. So this evening we are honored to have Randal Maurice Jelks, Professor of African and African American and American Studies at the University of Kansas. And is that where you're zooming in from this evening?
Actually, I'm in Michigan this evening.
Okay. That's the beauty of Zoom, isn't it? I mean, we can be anywhere. And Dr. Jelks is a widely published historian also. I have learned that you are an essayist as well and a documentary film producer. And I am not read your books yet, but they are now on my list. They also look completely fascinating. One of them, among many, is African Americans in the Furniture City. I didn't know this term, the Furniture City, the struggle for civil rights in Grand Rapids. Another is Benjamin Elijah Mays, schoolmaster of the movement. And another, although not all of them can be in this list, Letters to Martin, Meditations on Democracy in Black America. Thank you both for honoring us with your presences. And I'd like to turn it over now to Dr. Jelks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And I am a proud author of on UNC Press as well, publishing a biography called Benjamin Elijah Mays, Schoolmaster of the Movement. UNC is a great press, and I encourage my own graduate students, if they can, meet up to the standards to try to get published there. But enough about that. I am so delighted and excited to be with Amrita. I'm going to call her Amrita because we've known each other for a long time, and tell the audience that we were in Los Angeles when I first learned about this book. I think it was at the Association of Black Women Historians, or maybe earlier. It can't. But what excited me, I said, well, she presented a paper, and I was like, oh, there's got to be more. This is juicy. This is real juicy. Historians don't think about things as juicy. I know, but I tell my students history is a soap opera all the time. And so I was so thrilled about this publication, and about what she's doing. And when you read this book, one of her blurbers say it reads like a novel. And this is the first thing I thought about, Amrita, when I was reading through this wonderful publication, is Edward P. Jones's The Known World, which was published and won the Pulitzer Prize back in 2003, 2004, somewhere in that, because it reads like a novel, and it is juicy like a soap opera. And you might want to tell our audience, how did you get there? What sleuthing did you do to get there?
You mean, so I'm assuming you're asking me about the sources.
Yeah, of course.
I know, I always tell my students that really I feel like I'm a historical private detective. And I spend so much of my time, it's like the equivalent of going through the paparazzi, going through people's trash right now. But we're trying to piece together fragments that have been left behind, like 50 or 75 or 100 pieces of a 500 or 1,000 piece jigsaw puzzle. And so I had entered into the project thinking that it would be easier to do this project, that there would be a lot of sources and a lot of materials, because Richard Johnson was a career politician, 45 years of his life, senator, congressman, one-term vice president. And so I thought, gosh, there's going to be boxes and boxes and boxes of materials. There's going to be a, vice presidential library. I'm going to not know. Unlike my first book, I thought I'm just going to be wading in materials, right? It's not that I wanted to write a book about Richard, but I knew that I would have to go through him and his records to get to Julia and her daughters, Imogen and Adeline, because we know that when we're working on 18th and 19th century Black women, most of whom were illiterate, although Julia and her daughters were not, we have to kind of go through the white folks that they're sort of surrounded by at the time in order to get to their lives and their stories. But what shocked me was the fact that there was no large Richard Mentor Johnson collection. There's no vice presidential library. There are no boxes and boxes of materials, even though all three women were literate and wrote letters back and forth to husband and father when he lived in Washington, D.C. All of those letters, poof, gone. They don't exist anymore. And I was left going, what happened? Where's all my material? But that's when I realized, well, first of all, I have the great skills that I was taught as a graduate student and that I honed writing that first book, Forging Freedom, that took me back to public records. And so I looked at wills, and I looked at estate records, and I looked at church registers, and I looked at newspapers, and I combed the archive, vacuumed the archives dry for every single bit of evidence that I could find that talked about Julia and her daughters, and about Richard and their family life together in the public eye. Because he was a politician, I could do that. If he had been a regular person like you and I, there wouldn't have been the abundance of newspaper material. But I was also very fortunate that there was a small collection of papers, letters that Richard had written to, right? Letters that he had written to other people are scattered all over the country, but there's a small collection at the Filson Historical Society in Louisville, Kentucky. And so I was able to use those letters. I was able to, like I said, use newspapers, church materials, wills. But I was also, in addition to that, in addition to sort of doing all of that really deep kind of social, historical, archival work that I was trained to do, I also was fortunate that I was introduced to and built relationships with the descendants of the family. And a half dozen of those descendants agreed to sit down, and I interviewed them about about their stories, about how they did or didn't know about their lineage. And several of those descendants had personal family archives that they opened to me. And so that was really instrumental in helping me, get more material that helped me shape the back end of the book, particularly the last chapter. But I also realized that I needed to go outside of the regular sources in terms of what we as historians, right? We're kind of wedded to the written word in so many ways. But I realized that if I really wanted to get to Julia's story and to her voice, I needed to step outside of what I call the settler colonial archive, because those were spaces that were never built for Black women, for Black people, for Indigenous people. They weren't meant to hold their stories. And so they
Well,
were.
I'm going to stop. I want to stop you there for
Yeah,
our
sure.
audience, because you use, I know what you mean.
The settler colonial archive.
Yeah. So tell our audience, for a general audience, well, really, what does that mean
Yeah.
to
Oh,
for them?
well, so this is a space that is created by white men for white men, and it's really a violent space in many respects, because the records that are salvaged, particularly from the early period that we're talking about, from the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, people who are wealthy, people who are illiterate, people who are enslavers, people who are, right, it's the power brokers, the politicians. It's not a place that was ever meant to hold the voices of the regular or the average, certainly not the enslaved or free Blacks or
Or the
women.
property list.
Right, the property list, the poor, the indigenous. And so that's why I call it a settler colonial space, because it's those folks who came and pushed Native Americans off their land and brought enslaved Africans over here to do the labor on that land that built those spaces. And it's right, we talk about the victors who write the stories and the narratives. And so those are the documents that we're left with, right? Documents about the slave trade, about buying and selling. These are not documents that necessarily humanize Black people, because they weren't seen as humans by the folks who built these archives. So when I realized that I couldn't just use the written word, I needed to actually go beyond that. And for a historian, that can be a little bit scary. I mean, anthropologists and geographers have been doing this for a long time, but for me, I said, well, if I want to really get to Julia's voice, if I want to hear her, I need to go to the land where she lived. I need to go to the church where she worshiped. I need to go to the cemeteries where people are buried. I need to talk to the descendants, which I was able to do. I need to try and touch as many of the things that she would have touched in the spaces where she would have lived and walked, because when history and the violence of the archive takes away the written word, even for a woman who was literate, then you have to go beyond that in order to build that richer, thicker context and be able to create that world for the reader, and bring them into her life and into 18th and 19th century Kentucky. So
Yeah.
that's what I did. And I don't think I would have had the bravery to do it when I was a graduate student or with my first book, but I just felt, I had to do it for this one, and I felt the freedom to do it, and I did. So hopefully it worked.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned is that you speculate, at least, that it was the vice president's brother who destroyed records. And I found that to be lots of cases. People don't want outside children. They don't want whatever it seems to blemish the family, and those records are gotten rid of. And it seems to me that you came across that, or
So
you suggest that.
yeah, when Richard passed away, he had by that point made sure to transfer most of his plantation properties, enslaved laborers, the bulk of his estate and wealth to his children and grandchildren. And Julia had predeceased him. But whatever little bit was left, his two remaining living brothers went to court and had him declared dead, number one, because they said, he had passed away. They said that he didn't have a will, that he was intestate. And they then said that, the only relatives or kin that he had living were these two brothers. They said he had no parents, no sisters, no wife or children or other descendants living, which was a bald-faced lie, because his daughter Imogene and
Great opening for a movie. Great opening for
all
a
his
movie.
grandchildren are right there in Scott County, and this probate judge knows that. And so you can just see that he's in cahoots with these two brothers. He declares Richard dead, says, yes, there's no other descendants but you two, and whatever is left, they take, right? I mean, so you can just, and I'm like, well, they go a long way to making sure Imogene doesn't get anything left of her father's estate, and having her, like, literally erasing her from the record, like she doesn't even exist. And so it's kind of like not too far out of the scene to then take another step and say, well, where are 45 years of this politician's records? Even in Washington, D.C., there's only a tiny little 160 letter collection, and it's all business materials. Where's all his personal stuff? I'm like, these two men, if they would go to probate court and do that, it's just not it's not surprising to me that they would have taken that next step and tried to, like, erase evidence of Julia's existence, because it was always embarrassing to the Johnson family that Richard had this unconventional wife and this unconventional life.
But he wasn't the only one, of course. As you mentioned, there are lots of different unconventional relationships going on. So why do you think it was accepted in this patriarchal world? But why did it have to be so hidden? I mean, Thomas Jefferson, as we well know from now, and one person you mentioned, of course, others come along. Yeah.
I think what's so different, though, is that in that time and space, people like Henry Clay, people like Thomas Jefferson, right, all of these men who are having these, outside relationships, right, and children with these enslaved women, they don't publicly flaunt it. They don't acknowledge it. Most of them are married to white women. Jefferson doesn't begin his relationship with Hemmings until after his wife has passed away. But even so, he doesn't flaunt Sally as his wife. She doesn't entertain by his side as the mistress of Monticello. He doesn't acknowledge their children. It's gossip and everyone talks about it, but he never says, yes, this is my family. Richard, on the other hand, unlike, and when Henry Clay is caught by his wife having sex with his Black mistress in the quarters, he sells the woman and their biracial children downriver to Louisiana to get rid of the evidence and to keep the peace with his wife. Right? Julia is Richard's only wife. He doesn't have a white wife. Imogene and Adeline are his only acknowledged children. There may well be others with other women, but these are the only ones that he acknowledges, and they live together. He educates the daughters. Julia is standing by his side when he entertains former presidents and the Marquis de Lafayette when he comes to visit. Everyone in the area knows that she is, the head in front of his household, the mistress of the parlor. she oversees the bank accounts, the lines of credit, the enslaved labor force. She is for all intents and purposes, in every way that matters. She's doing all the labor of a wife, and she carries the status and position of a wife. She carries the keys to everything on Blue Spring Farm, and everything, all the decisions go through her when Richard is in Washington, which is for 6 months every year. But that's the problem, you see, when newspaper editors start writing about their frustration with Johnson, it's not because he's having sex with a Black woman, because everybody, like you said, it's very common that white men at this point are doing this. It's the fact that he was so open about it, that he was public about it, bald-faced and naked about it. Why couldn't he just lie like everybody else and keep it hidden? And then it would be fine. But he was forcing people to acknowledge this as his family. He was trying to take the daughters, he was trying to take his girls to town barbecues. Julia was riding around town in a carriage, which, I mean, carriages were reserved for white people, for white women. They openly worshiped together at Great Crossing Baptist Church, which Richard's parents had founded, just 2 miles down the road from their farm. And they, not up in the segregated Black balcony, but on the floor. So this is not hidden, right? This is in your face. Like, this is my family, accept it. And that's what causes all the brouhaha, right?
So I'm from New Orleans. I'm like, what's the big deal here, right?
I know. I was like, well, you're from Louisiana. This doesn't sound at all surprising to you. But you have to consider that this is rural Kentucky. This is not Charleston. This is not New Orleans. This is not even Baltimore. This is not an urban area. This is Great Crossing, Kentucky. It's not even Lexington or Louisville, Kentucky. Even today, if you go to Stamping Ground and Great Crossing and Georgetown, they are still very small. It's only just now getting to the point where locals from Georgetown say, well, now I maybe don't know everybody. Because, so, I mean, you have to understand how small this area is that we're talking about. And Richard's family is one of the first families of Kentucky, quite literally. I mean, his family comes, out of Virginia. They help settle the territory. His father is a surveyor and is able to therefore claim all the best land for him and his sons. He also helps to sign the territorial and then the state constitution. The Johnson men they grow up to be, congressmen and senators and vice presidents and attorney generals and lieutenant governors. I mean, this is a very powerful family we're talking about. This is like the first, it's like the one percenters, right? They are one of the first families of Kentucky, right? And the senior Johnsons have all kind of hopes, like, for all of their children, not just professionally, but also maritally, right? Most of the children are marrying other powerful, prominent families, not just within Kentucky, but across the country, which allies them with powerful planter wealth in Virginia, in Mississippi, right? I mean, these are the movers and shakers that we're talking about. And so here's this one son who just is like, no, I'm not going to walk that road. I did it my way.
Yeah.
Right?
So the question for me was, well, okay, he's not going to rock that road. He's an entitled person in his world. But Julia has to make a decision on which side of the world she's going to land. Yes. And she is quite adept as a businesswoman, running an organization, running, as you put it so marvelously, as a CEO. I kept wondering, I wish we had some more to her interior to understand the way she viewed her choices.
Sure, but I mean, I think it's not, I think when you look at the limited choices and the limited options that enslaved people had in general, and enslaved women in particular had, would Julia ever have had the choice to say no to Richard in terms of becoming his sexual partner? Could she have just said, well, thanks, but I would actually rather marry this guy over here who I grew up with in the quarters, right? So even if, like Thomas Jefferson, even if Johnson isn't physically violent towards Julia, there's all kinds of other tactics of physical, of mental and emotional coercion that go on, particularly when you consider that when they meet, he's 30 and she's about 14. And so that's really, you have to think about that, this, the power in terms of, master and enslaved person, but also the age dynamic and the gender dynamic all sort of rolled in together. So she doesn't really have, she has a lot of bad options. So which is the least bad option of the options she has? She never is able to really utilize the relationship to necessarily gain a whole lot for herself, right? She dies enslaved. She never owns property of her own. Yes, she's literate, but apparently that literacy was, she learned how to read and write through Richard's parents, because that she was owned by the senior Johnsons, and then they transferred her along with about 100 other laborers to Richard when he came of age and began to build his own home on his own farm. So Richard, but look at her daughters, look at what she's able to acquire for her daughters, right? She's like, I'm here I am as a young girl, but not even a woman in the, in early 1800s Kentucky. There's not a bustling urban area. There's not a large community of Black folks for me to hang out with. I have to make a pathway forward for my daughter, for my future children, for my descendants. And this is probably going to be the only way out for them. And it does become the pathway out for them. They are able to acquire freedom, marriages, like very stable marriages to white men. They inherit a massive amount of property from their father. They become landed gentry. They own slaves. They own land. They get cash. They become, right, part of the elite, part of the 1%. This is not something that Julia ever acquired for herself, nor would she have been able to probably acquire that had she not made the decision to ally herself and stay allied with a man who, although he called her wife, he was always her enslaver. He never ever set her free. And so that power dynamic can't be lost on her. But she has to wend this very narrow path between being property and also being, wife, having control to a certain extent on Blue Spring Farm, but always knowing that if she doesn't keep this man happy, her privileges are going to disappear, right? And so, I mean, as parents, how much are we willing to sacrifice for our children? What will we not do in order to make sure that they are safe and secure? And so these are the unholy choices that Julia has to make because of white supremacy, because of slavery, right? And so we don't know what choices she would have made had she been free and able to do so. But this is what she does, given the choices she has.
I want to ask a couple of more questions, and then I would like you to read one of your passages that you like a lot. The first question, it has to do, is a kind of comparative lens. There are a number of little books written on Italian in the era of what we call, the historians label, the Italian Renaissance, of young girls being forcibly arranged to marry older men, powerful, rich men. Now they have to come from rich homes to marry these men, but they're still very much underage. And then in your acknowledgement, you, toward the end, very movingly so, acknowledge your grandmothers and great-grandmothers who also are in some sense bound or in arranged marriages. Could you tell us a little bit more, because it seems that the world as a whole, not just this world of Kentucky, had women, for no other word, bound.
Yeah, I think that this is one of the things that I've been talking about to people is that, everyone is sort of like, why do you call her a wife? Why do you call her a wife? Was it a legal marriage? And, and I said, well, I think we need to understand that even people who had legal contract marriages, that didn't necessarily mean or translate into equity or equality for the women inside those marriages. Um, you know, we today think of marriages, right? Companionate, people get to choose. It's about romance and love and partnership. But in the time periods that we're talking about, marriages were arranged by families, and the white people arranged marriages for their daughters, right? And in the South, girls as young as 14, 15, 16 were being married off to men in their late 20s or early 30s or even older, because women were prized for their fertility, their years of reproductive productivity. Men were prized for their financial stability. And so you had older men with younger women, with teenage girls. For that reason, it was not unheard of. It was the standard, actually. But how much choice did those young white girls have to be bound into those relationships with those older men? It was their fathers and sometimes their mothers who helped to arrange those contracts. It was about family alliances, bringing together powerful families, bringing together land, political power, all of those kinds of things. It was not about whether or not she liked him or whether he even liked her necessarily, right? And then, so I look at the fact that patriarchy does a number on all of these women, but for Julia, she's further bound not only by patriarchy, but also by race and by formal enslavement. And I was thinking so much when I knew I wanted to dedicate my book to my grandmothers, but I had been thinking so much about the fact that so much of what they wanted for their children and their grandchildren, they were never able to attain for themselves. They were never able to acquire formal education. They were never able to go to university. They couldn't have imagined the world that I live in and that I work in. Because that was just, they were expected, they were to get married, and they were married at 12 and 14, and they were to have children, and they were supposed to be, that helpmeet to their husbands, right? Mothers, wives, entertaining guests, like all of those kinds of things that Julia had to do, right? My grandmothers had to engage in that. And people think, well, but they stayed together for 30, 40, 50 years. And I said, there are people today who have been together for 30, 40, and 50 years, and we know that they're not necessarily happy together, but they've stayed together for lots of other reasons other than happiness. They made a choice to stay together for all kinds of reasons. And so I mean, both sets of my grandparents were together until death. That was how they were raised. I don't know how they felt about their situations, but I certainly know how much they valued making life better for their children and their grandchildren. And I know that I directly benefit from that. And so patriarchy, even when we're looking out, in the 20th and 21st centuries, those bonds of patriarchy are still very strong. And I mean, we're talking just 1 or 2 generations back. We're not talking 200 or 300 years ago when we're talking about our grandparents.
And let me follow up on that with my last little question. Then I want you to read a passage. And that is back in the 90s, I think it's Catherine McClinton and other people were writing about the plantation mistress and the jealousies and the ire of having the slave owner having children who look like on the plantation. I get the sense, although you don't bring this out, Julia is the plantation mistress, right? She's running but I'm wondering what the neighboring upper class women thought. I didn't get that as a good sense of whether their jealousies toward her and so forth. I mean, she has a standing in a way that other women don't, Black women particularly.
There's a lot of jealousy. That's one of the main things that I try to get across in the book, is that um, in the, the book is what I call sort of a sunshine to shadows sort of a story, because in the beginning it seems to be like there's a lot of positivity, a lot of acceptance. Julia's running all of, she has so much privilege. She's running things on the farm. She's worshiping at Great Crossing Baptist Church. But then when we get into the middle and towards the back half of the book, you begin to see that her world is actually very small, because aside from, Blue Spring Farm and Great Crossing Baptist Church, there's really not too many other places where she can go and really be fully accepted. And even at Great Crossing Baptist Church, yes, she sits on the floor, but in 2 special seats on the floor. Right. So it's in this limbo space. Even on her own plantation, there's tensions with the indigenous students and the white teachers of Choctaw Academy, who are uncomfortable with the fact that Black women are running things when Richard is not present, because they, have seen and been, sort of, and in self-defense have become enslavers themselves of African people, hoping that that will stave off genocide and elimination, and they'll be able to hold on to their lands. So even at home and at church, it's not full acceptance. But when they try to step out into the community, her daughters try to go to the local barbecue with dad on the 4th of July, and that is shut down immediately. It doesn't matter how educated they are, how well dressed they are, how wealthy the family is. That's a line that the community draws in the sand and says, Adeline cannot sit under the tent with the mothers and sisters and daughters and wives of white folks in the community. And so, and there's also jealousy over how the Johnson women dress. They don't dress like Black women. Because there were these ideas about station and clothing. They dress like wealthy white plantation women, right? Because that's what they are. They're plantation mistresses, and that is exactly how they dress. And there's constant commentary in the newspapers about the jealousy that this causes, the angst that this causes, because are they going to try to ask for more rights, more privileges, more power? Because they're behaving like free women, are they therefore going to start to demand the privileges of free women? And they start to do so, absolutely. And we see what happens when the daughters begin to marry white men, and all holy hell breaks loose in the press.
Right.
What's happening in the press is a reflection of what's being said in the community. Many of those editorials include letters from anonymous members of the community who are upset and complaining about what is happening. Because again, if Richard had just if this had been quietly kept under wraps, but for these women to be articulate and educated and well-dressed and, going to church and marrying white men and doing inheriting property. Well, that's the problem. They're crossing out of private spaces into public places. And that's when it's not acceptable.
But first, please, by all means, read something. I could go on with the questions forever, but I really want the audience, because this is you really do write a fine piece of prose, my friend. So please, by all means.
Well, I'll do a short reading and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Absolutely. So let me go ahead. So I'm reading from, oh goodness, pardon me. I'm reading from chapter 1, and Julia and about 100 other enslaved laborers have just been told that they're going to be sent away from the senior Johnson's farm and be sent to Blue Spring Farm, which is Richard's home, which is about 2 miles away. And 2 miles at that point might as well be 200, right? We're talking 18. So this is the scene that I'm going to share with you a little bit. 1810. That's the year everything changed. While Julia's life had taken a serious turn at the age of 6, the day Jemima Johnson came to the quarters and pointed at her, her world turned upside down the day she was forced to move to Blue Spring Farm, a couple of miles up the road from Johnson Station, leaving her mother, Henrietta, behind. That was the day any remaining fragments of her childhood vanished. Richard Mentor Johnson owned Blue Spring. A gift from Robert Johnson to his son, Julia came to Blue Spring along with 100 other laborers from Johnson's fort to help Richard set up his new home. Richard was by then a congressman in Washington, D.C. Julia was literate, knew a fair bit of frontier medicine, and she had a reputation for being a great cook. Richard was a lawyer by training. He rode horses, was a great dancer, and he was popular with the young society women in Kentucky and Washington. He was then 30 years old and had reddish hair. Julia, according to oral tradition, was about 13 or 14 years old that year and weighed only 90 pounds. She was Black. He was white. She was enslaved. He was her new owner. Sending 100 laborers to Blue Spring rocked the lives of every Black person at Johnson Station. There's no enslaved family that wouldn't have been affected by such a massive movement of people. Robert would have sent the laborers Richard needed most to get his plantation up and running, including field hands, skilled craftsmen, and household staff. Black families would have been divided to serve Richard's interests. Henrietta's household was absolutely devastated by Robert's gift to his son. She not only lost Julia, she also lost her son Daniel, who was also sent to Blue Spring. It didn't matter that they were only 2 miles away. She couldn't keep an eye on her children anymore. She couldn't cook for Daniel, watch him sleep at night, or take care of him when he was sick. There was even less chance of her being able to protect her beautiful young daughter from sexual assault. 2 miles might as well have been 200. Every enslaved parent feared being separated from their children. They all knew that their owners' debts or deaths could lead to Black families being torn apart to raise money or to fulfill inheritances. In one way, this might have been a best case scenario because Henrietta's children were still in the neighborhood and they belonged to her owner's son. She would be able to see them at church on Sundays, if not spend the day with them. And she could likely run up the road in case of an emergency. But that would have been of cold comfort to her the day her children were marched off the fort and up the road to Blue Spring, leaving her alone in her small cabin. There is no telling what Henrietta thought or did when she heard that her children were going to be moved away from the station. When Julia went up the road to Blue Spring Farm, she had no idea what her new life would be like. She had just left her mother behind, along with the only home she had ever known. The young girl was surely terrified and grief-stricken. Her brother Daniel was with her, but there was no telling if they would be living together or what her role at Blue Spring would be. She had never had any significant interactions with Richard Johnson in the past, so she had no clue if he would be a cruel or a kind master. He also lived in Washington for half the year, and it wasn't clear who would actually be in charge when he was away. Julia was also probably anxious to see the main house and the quarters in order to determine what her new work and living conditions would be. When the house was properly finished, Richard's mother came to help him furnish his new home. It was Jemima Johnson who once again changed the whole course of Julia's life. She told Richard that he needed a housekeeper capable of keeping things in order for him. The housekeeper wouldn't do the work herself, but would oversee everything at Blue Spring. Jemima then told Richard that she had already gone down to the quarters and selected Henrietta's girl, 14 years old, quote, well-trained and almost pretty for the position. Mrs. Johnson was waxing enthusiastic about young Julia's qualities as a potential housekeeper, stating that the girl was, quote, neat and trim, quick in movement, and will not grow up bulky and awkward. She weighs only 90 pounds and will look well around the house. The matter was settled. Now, although Julia had trained as a domestic servant for the last 8 years of her life, this was a very big step, being a housekeeper for a bachelor politician. There was no wife on the premises, which meant that she had to manage Richard's large household, oversee the whole staff, as well as organize the fabulous parties for which Richard was known. Enslaved housekeepers were powerful persons on large plantations. Julia would carry the keys to the estate clipped to her belt, choose the daily food menu, do all the shopping, handle the deliveries of and payment for all goods and supplies, organize and oversee the work assignments for the household staff, handle minor punishments, and take care of the needs of all house guests and more. There was, however, also great risk to being a housekeeper. It was very common for white men who engaged in sexual relationships with enslaved women throughout the Atlantic world to refer to their Black mistresses as their housekeepers, or for their housekeepers to become their mistresses. Indeed, there appeared to be a very fine line between the two. One wonders if this long history of sexual relations between masters and housekeepers was on Julia's mind as she prepared to take on the role of Richard's ménagère, as they were called in French-speaking areas such as New Orleans. Certainly, it didn't take long for this to happen. By 1811, when Julia was only 14 or 15 and Richard 31, the pair had begun having sex. It was an arrangement that continued for the next 22 years and would produce 2 daughters.
Thank you so much for that. And now we should turn to our live stream for Q&A. Amrita, I'm so very, very, very proud to even be associated with this book. Congratulations.
Thank you, Randall. And I appreciate you've been such a wonderful mentor these last several years, and you've written many a letter for me, and I appreciate you. So, and thank you for being here tonight.
Yeah.
Thank you both. Yes, Amrita, thank you so much for that reading and for the conversation so far. And there's so much more to read about in the book. But thank you for digging into just a little of it to whet everyone's appetites for the rest. I want to start with a question of my own, if you don't mind, and remind folks at home to go ahead and submit their questions either in chat or via email. But when did you first encounter Julia Chen?
I actually stumbled across a small paragraph in a US survey textbook that talked about Richard Johnson and his quote unquote, many concubines, right? Many mulatto mistresses and concubines. And I was a little bit taken aback because I thought to myself, well, hang on, who is this guy, right? They're talking about this vice president and how he had all of these relationships and how abolitionists actually used him as an example of why slavery should be abolished, because here are these white men who are so powerful who are abusing enslaved women on their plantations. And I thought to myself, well, and they said, they said that he never married a white woman, but that he had 3 Black wives, or, they actually called them concubines or mulatto mistresses. And so I was actually finishing my first book at the time. And so I said, let me come back to this, because I've never heard this story. I've never heard of Johnson. I've never heard of any of these women. How have I not, when I'm a 19th century scholar? And so when that was my first introduction to, Julia in this very offhanded kind of way, it was really not really about her. It was about Johnson and his many mistresses, right? But that's kind of, I started, when I came back to it, I fell down the rabbit hole.
Yeah. And so then how long was then that, because you said you were working on another, you had another book in between, right? So then how long was the journey from that first introduction to Julia to your launch, your book launch last night?
So I've been working on the book for 12 years. Yeah. So
well, congratulations congratulations on the book. And so you talked at the beginning, Dr. Jelks asked a question that led to a wonderfully insightful response about the differences between Johnson and other men who were engaged in similar relationships, but relationships that were not public, and the biggest problem that people had with his relationship was that he didn't have the, this is my interpretation, that he just didn't have the common decency to, keep it under wraps and marry a white woman, and just do what everybody else did, right? So did you come across, or were you able to find enough to talk in the book about what made him different in that way? Why he chose to behave so differently with regards to those relationships than the other men that he was surrounded by?
I mean, this is like trying to get at, people's, human beings' interior sort of.
Right. And as you said, there's a dearth of documentation as well, right? So
there is a dearth of documentation. I mean, in the later part of his life, it seems that Richard is there seems to be mental deterioration that's happening as in the later part of his life, but there didn't seem to be any of that necessarily earlier on. There's oral tradition about the fact that he began his relationship with Julia in retaliation and out of spite towards his mother, because she wanted him to make a good match, right? A good political alliance kind of marriage. And he, according to some oral traditions, he had gotten engaged to a working class girl from up north who was a seamstress or a school teacher. And so that didn't fly well with the family. And so there's one branch of oral tradition that suggests that Jemima Suggett Johnson, who was a very powerful personality indeed, was like, absolutely no way, you're not going to marry her, I forbid it. And so supposedly Richard broke off that relationship, but then said, you will come to regret this. And then takes up with Julia, who is his mother's, this is a woman, Julia has been trained by Jemima from the time she was 6 to be a domestic servant. Jemima goes down to the quarters and pulls Julia out of the quarters, brings her into the main house, and alongside the other house staff, they train her from the age of 6 until she's 14 and goes to Blue Spring Farm. So Jemima is the reason, according to family legend, that Julia knows how to read and write, that she has all of these skills. So it's not just that he takes up with an enslaved woman, but he takes up with that particular enslaved woman who is his mother's particular, protege, if you want to think about it that way. And so it's kind of a slap in the face. But after his parents die, why doesn't he just, marry a white woman and, sort of continue to keep Julia on the side like so many of these men do? I can't really explain that. That would mean going into his mind and trying to sort of unravel that connection. What I can say is that there's no evidence that Richard Johnson ever had, there's no concrete evidence that he ever had any relationships with white women. Not even after Julia passed away. The other women that he did have relationships with after Julia passed away, which were much more coercive and far less consensual, were all with Black women. And so, there are some people who would just say, well, he maybe just didn't like white women. Maybe he just wasn't attracted to them. So, but I don't know that for sure, right? That would entail me taking a leap well beyond informed speculation and get into a flight of fancy that I just can't do.
Yeah. And we know that you're a historian. I am a historian. So we're not asking you to do that. Just curious about whether or not.
My advisor would be very disappointed if I tried to do that.
We're but just didn't know if there was any pebble out there that might have had some suggestion. I'm sorry, Dr. Jelks.
That's why that's why I began with the known world, because in that very novel, the chief character is groomed and to run a plantation, and so fiction writers are on the truth. It's just different than what we are trained as historians to do.
Exactly.
I would pray that there's some letter out there all during one of these days.
Right. So we're actually just past the top of the hour, and I if you're okay to go on for just a few more minutes, we do have a question from the audience, and I'll say hello to Kirk Brown, and I'm going to read Kirk's question, but I feel like something that you just said, Amrita, gives a little bit of an answer when you talked about the fact that his subsequent relationships were more coercive, and there's obviously, since you're using that information, there's documentation of that, and that sort of tells me something that might be part of an answer to this question. But Kirk's question is, given Richard Johnson's willingness to flaunt the prevailing mores of his day, as we were talking about, and his apparent affection for Julia, why do you suppose he never granted her freedom?
And that's one of the things that everyone asks me. And of course,
Yeah. And you don't have, yeah.
But I mean, I would just say that we have to keep in mind that Richard Johnson he's always an enslaver. He has almost 100 enslaved laborers on his 2,000-acre plantation. He regularly has people beaten. He regularly mortgages enslaved people when he finds himself short on cash or in debt, which he often was because he liked to live the large life, right? He, sold people for infractions or, for disciplinary reasons. And so I really think that it's important to keep in mind that just because he may have made an exception for one woman and their 2 daughters doesn't mean that he made exceptions for the entire race, right? It's like people today who, like, when you confront them on their biases, say, well, I can't possibly be prejudiced or bigoted or racist. I have a Black friend, or, and you sort of look at them and say, right, actually the exception often upholds the rule, right? And for Richard, Julia, maybe not even so much Julia, but his daughters were definitely the exception. We have letters where he writes, and it's very clear that he loves his daughters. And he made definitive pathways for them. He had them formally educated. He made sure that they were, given notarized deeds to like large, tracts of land, gifts of enslaved laborers. He made estates for his grandchildren as well. He was very careful to like lay all of this out. And do it in such a way, like good, arrange good marriages for them when they turned 18, right? He made sure that they were protected, free, educated, all of those things. He never did that for Julia. And people always say, well, like in Kentucky, there are still people who are like, but he loved her. I'm like, then why didn't he manumit her? Why didn't he manumit her? If this is not a coercive relationship, if he truly, I think he respected her. I think he valued her business acumen. I think he actually trusted her because he gave her a lot of free reign and power to run things in his absence. But at the end of the day, he did not cut that last tie because I think he feared that she would leave. So he always had to have that last element of control over her, and she died enslaved. Yeah. And so I just want us to always keep in mind that the exception does not, it often upholds the rule because he made an exception for his daughters. He made a partial exception for Julia. He treated other enslaved people on his property and other enslaved women on his property the way you would expect an enslaver to behave. And in fact, he even mortgages Julia's brother, Daniel, and Daniel's wife at one point when he's hard up for cash. Now, he doesn't end up having to sell them, he gets them back, but it doesn't even matter that they're Julia's kin. So that's how far this man is willing to go.
Yeah. The as you say, being an enslaver is at the core, regardless of what other side decisions. It's deep.
White supremacy and structural racism is at the core of it all.
Yeah.
And that's dictating everyone's behavior. Right.
Yeah.
White, black,
I would slightly put that it's capital. It's capitalism, right? You mortgage the house to buy the bookstore. It's the way all those three intersect with each other, because it's definitely
it's racial capitalism in the United States.
That's what capitalism is, right?
Yeah. I mean, as Jennifer Morgan and others have shown so beautifully, right, in her recent book, Reckoning with Race, where, you know, it is the whole system of capitalism and numeracy is built on codifying Black bodies into as numbers, as units, as instruments of trade.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and as wholly separate from humanity, essentially, in a way that, you know, there's no, you know, and it's like there's a switch that's flipped there that doesn't get flipped back, whether or not you know, quote unquote, marry someone or not, right? It's
Well, and I
Yeah.
mean, the fact that we don't even know where Julia's buried has always, to me, just like, it's a point of grief for me, right? I'm still determined to find that grave. I mean, I'm positive she's buried on Blue Spring Farm property, because that's what families did back in the day, is they they buried their kin, their family on the homestead. And her older daughter, Imogene, is buried on her farm next to her husband. But we don't know where Adeline's grave is or where Julia's grave is. But Adeline inherited the home property, Blue Spring, which means when she passed away, she would have been buried at Blue Spring. And then, I mean, and I'm sure that that's where Julia's buried as well, but we don't know where the graveyards are. You know, we don't have stones, we don't have anything. And this is not something that would have happened if he had married a white woman, right? We wouldn't, Richard himself is buried in Frankfurt with a huge monument surrounded by dignitaries. I mean, but we've literally lost the vice president's wife.
Yeah.
Because she's
So it's almost 10 after, and there are actually a couple more questions, but I want to be respectful of your time and of everyone else's time, although we do have folks who are hanging out with us. So if could I ask just two more questions before we wrap up? Do you have,
Jelks, do you have time for two more questions?
do you have two?
Oh, yeah, I think this
Okay.
is wonderful.
Okay,
Please,
thank you.
by all means.
Thank you. So Elizabeth, who introduced you earlier, thanked you first for the incredible story. And Elizabeth was curious about Choctaw Academy, and if you could say any more about that, or let us know if there's more in the book, or direct us to.
Yeah, a whole chapter on Choctaw Academy, and the way the book is constructed. We go from frontier Kentucky, and Henrietta's life, and Julia's birth. And then that second chapter takes us into Julia's life as mistress of Blue Spring Farm, when she's running the farm and she has the children, and Richard is coming and going to DC. The third chapter focuses on Choctaw Academy and Julia and the other enslaved persons on Blue Spring, their interactions with the headmaster and the teachers and the students of Choctaw Academy. Chapter 4 takes us to Great Crossing Baptist Church and focuses on the interactions there. Chapter 5 takes us out into the larger local community. Chapter 6 to the nation state, Washington, DC, and the political issues of national elections. And then chapter 7 focuses on the daughters and the grandchildren and the descendants of the family. So that's kind of, we move chronologically, but we're also moving from the smallest home spaces to the larger national stages. And that's how the book is constructed. So chapter 3 looks very closely at Choctaw Academy. It was the very first federally funded Indigenous boarding school in the United States. And it was on Richard's property. It was on Blue Spring Farm. He was able to utilize his political pull and privilege to have the school housed there as opposed to somewhere else. And because he saw it as a cash cow, he saw it as a way to make money, right? Tuition dollars flowing in, money coming from the government, money coming from Choctaw Nation, right? And using his own enslaved labor force to keep down the costs, right? They would do all the labor on top of everything they're already doing at the farm. They would be doing the cooking and the cleaning and the laundry and the sewing. And so he puts Julia and his daughters and all of his enslaved laborers to work to get Choctaw Academy up and running, and to keep it running for over 20 years. So that, but what it does is it's an Indigenous boarding school for boys, for young boys and young men, teenagers mostly, who are mostly they are the sons of leaders, elders, chiefs of their nation. And they come already being exposed to Black slavery, right? Many of them come from not only slaveholding nations, but slaveholding families. And so then they come to Blue Spring Farm and they're like, hang on a second. Richard Johnson is gone for 6 months of every year, and he leaves the whole place in running, it's being run by Black women, enslaved Black women, Julia and then her daughters. And they're like, this makes no sense to us. And this is very confusing and also frustrating, because they've been told and taught by the system of racial capital and white supremacy that Black is lower than, right? And they are trying to maintain a tenuous foothold on this racial hierarchy. They're already losing land, losing privilege, facing genocide, right? They have to keep themselves one rung above the ladder. And so to allow Black women to be in charge over them is not going to fly. It's not going to go well. And so there's a lot of tension that happens, because of the fact that Choctaw Academy is on the premises of Blue Spring Farm, because you're bringing these students together with enslaved laborers and with Julia Chin and her daughters, and the white teachers. The headmaster lives on the property, and so it's a recipe for disaster.
That sounds like a whole other book that would be.
It is actually, because my colleague Christina Snyder has already written that book.
Okay, please tell us what that book is.
Hey, she wrote a book called Great Crossings.
Okay,
and it's about focusing on the boarding school and about indigenous, right? About that's at the heart of her story.
Okay.
So that's not my story. I write one chapter because I'm really trying to look at the interactions between enslaved folks and students at Blue Spring Farm, and particularly Julia and her daughters. But Dr. Snyder's book is about Richard Johnson and Choctaw Academy and indigenous persons. And that's why, the town is called Great Crossing, but she literally calls her book Great Crossings, because it's all of these folks coming together in this one place. And what does that look like, right?
Thank you. Yes.
What it particularly looks like in the hierarchical world, we forget that we celebrate this equality, this rough equality, but this is a very hierarchical world. And of course, the Choctaw are part of that, the kind of civilized tribes, because they in fact hold slaves. So yeah, it's but the scene of, or the scenes of enslaved people sewing their uniforms and making clothing for them shows the kinds of the hierarchies of the society then.
And it's for people like Richard Johnson, however, he looks at indigenous people and Black people as all being beneath him because he's a white man.
Right. And
so, but it's sort of like people who are jockeying for position at the bottom of the totem pole, right? But folks from Choctaw Nation clearly see themselves as being, because of what they've been exposed to from this violence of settler colonialism. They're like, they see that, they are seeing themselves and are positioning themselves above Black people, because that's one of the only ways that they can sort of fathom that they could perhaps, sort of forward themselves as civilized and worthy of retaining, their rights to their land. In the long run, it doesn't work, as we know.
Of course not. Yeah. And so the rubric is set in this framework of white supremacy by white landholders, and then everyone else is just,
exactly.
Yeah.
But that's why I said, you start to see the ugliness in chapter 3. Maybe not quite so starkly in chapter 4. And then from chapter 5 onwards, you really start to see it unfold in some very unholy ways, how all of this unfolds.
Well, we certainly will recommend as well Great Crossings, in addition to your book. And I'm going to apologize for not getting to the other questions, because it's going on 7:20, and I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. But I think this has been So informative, and such a wonderful conversation. I know we've gotten a lot out of it. And I just want to recommend again that folks pick up the book for more, and pick up Great Crossings. And again, Amrita, congratulations. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you to Randal for agreeing to be in conversation with me tonight. I'm just thrilled, and I would just really encourage people, as was said before, please haunt your local bookstores. We need them. We love them. They are a treasure. Libraries and bookstores are treasures, and they need our support. My local launch last night was at our independent local bookstore here in Bloomington, and I couldn't have imagined a better evening, but I couldn't have imagined also doing it anywhere else. And so, if you're going to buy your books, please go and support your local bookstores.
Thank you so much for that, Amrita. And Randal, Dr. Jelks, thank you so much again for being with us.
My great pleasure. My great pleasure.
Thank you.
So happy to talk about this book.
Thanks again. And everyone who's with us tonight, thank you. We hope that you can join us for another event sometime, and stay safe and well in the meantime. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye-bye.